Now that we have this dynamic box linked to our text, let's turn it into a lower third. So I like to use my title and action safe guides for alignment for this. It's a good practice. So I'm just going to go to my little guide and grid menu and find the title action safe guides. The apostrophe key on the keyboard is the shortcut to turn that on and off. And this rectangle right here is the title safe box. So for broadcast on television, it's general practice to not have text outside of that box, just in case anything is cropped off on people's displays. But it's also just a good buffer between the edge of the screen and where you want to read this text. Now I want this to have 2 lines, not just the 1 line of text. So this text is not going to sit right on this guide, and it's probably way too big. Let me just scale this down a little bit, and let's type in my name. So I'll just use my name as an example, and I'll zoom in nice and close and point out that my anchor point is not touching this title safe guide, and that's because, remember, some characters could overlap that anchor point. So I'm just giving myself a little bit of buffer. It's okay that that box is going beyond it because it's not the actual text. It's just what needs to be read should be within those guides. So how do we get a second line on here? Well, I'm gonna just duplicate what I have already and make a few modifications. So I'll select both the line 1 text and the text box 1 shape and duplicate them, Command or Control D, and I'll just group them up at the top for now. And I'll just double click the text layer and say Motion Designer. All right, so this text box obviously isn't following this new text layer, and that's because expressions don't update when you duplicate them. They're still referencing this first line of text. The only reason it's moving with it is because the parenting relationship does carry over when you duplicate. So it assumes that I want these 2 duplicated layers to preserve the parent-child relationship that the original 2 already had. So we need to modify some of the expressions in here. Let's double tap E to bring up all of the expressions and take a look at what we need to modify. Well, before I even go into any of these, you can see that the first variable in these 3 expressions all use the source text of line 1 right here. And because they're all nice and organized, all I need to do to get the box to be sized and aligned to this second text layer is go into each one of these and change the layer name from line 1 to line 2. So I'll just do that for each one of these expressions. All of the variables are now referencing that second text layer. And just like that, my text box is now animating and sizing and aligning perfectly to the second line. So from here, I'm going to just scale this down a little bit. Maybe I'll make this 48 points and bring it down below the other text layer. I'm holding Shift while I move this to constrain it to the Y-axis when I'm moving. So maybe I want it about there. What I want to do next is make sure that it's aligned to this text layer on the horizontal axis. So I'm just going to parent line 1 to line 2 and press P to bring up the position and see that the X value is now 0, which means it's the same value relative to line 1. I can know for certain those are aligned, and it's 85 pixels down on the Y-axis from the original text layer. I'm just going to move my text box 2 layer down below text box 1 so it doesn't overlap that original text layer. And I need to make sure I give myself more room than this because remember, some letters have descenders. So if I put a lowercase g right here, that little leg on the G is a descender off of the baseline, which looks pretty cramped into that second line. So I'm going to bring that down a little bit more, just give it a little more breathing room. And that looks pretty good. But I want to point out that right here, if I zoom in nice and close, there's a little discrepancy between the 2 text boxes. The new text box is just slightly to the right. And that's because of the source rect time left value. The left value for this text layer is different than the left value for this text layer because they're different characters. Remember, it's dependent on the first character in the line of text. So for this second box, instead of taking the left value from this text layer, I want it to take it from the first text layer so that this is always perfectly aligned on the left edge. So let me double tap E on text box 2 one more time. And we don't need to worry about the size of the box. We want that to stay the same. But it's the position and the anchor point that are going to need just a slight modification. So let's go into the position expression. And I need a variable to reference that first line of text. So I'm going to just duplicate this first line. So triple click on it to select the whole thing, copy, drop down a line, and then paste. And I'll get rid of that extra line. And we're going to call this variable text2, just for simplicity. And we need to change line 2 back to line 1. So this is the original text layer that has my name in it. Then we just need to use that source for our .left property. So I'll come down to the L variable and change text to text2. So now we're getting the source rectit time .left value from the original text layer that has my name typed in. While I'm here, I'm just going to copy all of this because we're going to then apply it and do the exact same thing for the anchor point. You can see already that that seam is gone. They are now perfectly aligned, but now I need to change the anchor point so that the animation happens off of that edge. Because if I back up right here, it's very subtle, but you can see right there at the beginning of that animation, it's not scaling from the right place. So let's go into that anchor point property, go into the expression, and I'll just replace everything above this offset variable because this one was not part of this expression. But I'll just paste here. That adds in that extra line, changes L to text2. If I apply this, now everything should work perfectly. It scales off of the right point and it's aligned to the left edge properly. All right, so that solves that problem. And from here we can play around with the way that the animation plays out. Right now both lines are animating on at the exact same time, so I could grab line 2 and text box 2 and just scoot them forward a little bit, and then they're gonna offset. So that's cool. My first line has that accent box that we put in, so maybe I'd want to duplicate this text box and call it accent box 2, and then I could grab that same color and paste it, and then just scoot the second line forward a little bit in time. I think it was just 2 frames. And there we go. Now we've got that accent box on each frame. Now I would suggest that you trim off any layers that are hidden once the animation is finished. So these 2 accent boxes, once they're completely covered up, which would be at the end of the text box's animation, so right there, I will trim this off just so it's not sitting there anymore. And same thing for this one. I'm going to go to the second text box to where that is fully animated on and trim that accent box off at the same place. Cool. Now let's say that I'm happy with the way that this is looking, except I want to modify that margin. Well, now that I have a bunch of duplicates, I would have to go into every one of these boxes and modify that offset paths operator to do that. So let's actually start building some controls to make these kinds of adjustments a little bit easier. I'm going to make a null by going up to Layer, New, Null Object, and I'm going to name this Controls. And on this layer, I'm going to add an effect. I'll go up to Effect, down to Expression Controls, and these effects do absolutely nothing on their own. They're just there to control expressions, which is why they're called expression controls. The offset paths amount property is just a number, so we're going to control this with a slider. So I'm going to add a slider control, and it looks like this. It's just a slider value, and it gives me a number. Does not do anything on its own, it's just a number value. So let's name this offset amount. I did that just by selecting the effect and pressing enter and then pressing enter again. Now I want to keep this effect visible even when I click on another layer. You see, as I do that, it goes away. So with this layer selected, I'm going to click on this little lock icon under the effects controls panel. And now, even if I click off of that layer, it's going to stay up here and be visible. That's helpful because now what I want to do is search these 4 layers. I'll select all 4 of them for the amount property. And you'll notice this brings up even the expressions that have that term in it. But I want to find this offset paths 1 on each one of these layers. And what I'll do is link this amount value to that slider control. So using the property pick whip, I'm going to click and drag and come all the way up to the effects controls. This even works in a different panel. So I'll just select that slider, let go, and now that value is being driven by this slider. If I increase it or decrease it, we can see that happening. So I'm going to set that to 15 for now, just so I can see the difference, and then let's do that for the other boxes. So under offset paths amount, for the next box, I'm going to use the property pick whip to grab that slider. Easy as that, and I'll do that for the remaining 2 boxes. Okay, so now all of those are linked up. I can use this slider to adjust that offset paths, and it might even be a little bit easier if I twirl this down and I can go from 0 up to 100. If you wanted to change that value for any reason, you can. Just right click on slider and say edit value, and you can change the range of this slider. Now, I don't need to do that, so I'm going to leave it exactly as it is, but now we have the ability to modify that margin on the fly from this controls null that we created. These aren't necessarily controls that we want to give to the editor who's going to be using this template in Premiere, but it's a really great way of working inside of After Effects so you don't have to constantly be searching for values, opening and closing layers all the time. Instead, you just have one central location for your controls. All right, let's add a little bit more personality to this animation so it's not so static. I want to have this first box come out and then move up as this second line animates on. So right now I can't really do that because this text layer is parented to the first text layer. So let's actually break that relationship. I'll just take that off. And I'm also going to move the second line. So I need to make sure I have all three of those layers selected, move them forward out of the way for a second. And again, what I want to do is have this come out and then move up to this position. So maybe about right around this point is where I want it to end up at this point. So I'm going to add a position keyframe by pressing Alt-Shift-P or Command-P on a Mac, and then back up maybe 10 frames, Shift plus the page up key on the keyboard, and shift this down, so maybe about there. And on this part of the animation, I might even have it slide out a little bit. So maybe I'll line that up with the text box animation so that it stops moving at this point. So I'll add another keyframe right here, and then go back to the start of the layer and scoot this back a little bit. Not all the way off the screen, maybe just about to here. And I'll actually push this keyframe back even before that layer starts so that it's aligned with the text box. So now I have this animation that comes out and up. I just need to ease everything. So let's go into that position property, speed graph, ease everything, and just bring these handles to be a little bit more extreme. So maybe something like that. And I'm just going to work on the timing a little bit. I don't need any easing out of that first keyframe. And the second movement is a little extreme. So let's space that out just a little bit more. Give it some more time and modify this curve just a bit. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So at this point that it's moving up is when I want the next text box to be animating in. So let's go to right about here where it starts moving and grab those three layers, bring it back, and probably start it right about there. So now we can play this back and see what it all looks like together. All right, at this point I have a working lower third, which you can see right here. So it's totally functional, even though it is pretty basic. At this point, I'd probably want to go in and start tweaking things to make things more visually interesting. And that's exactly what we're gonna do in the next couple of lessons. At this point, you should go back into After Effects, and if you need those 2 lines of text, make sure that you can get it to a working point, but play around with the way that it animates. Do different fonts, use different text animators, customize it however you'd like. Then we can move on to the next lesson where we take this a little bit further and start customizing the way that everything looks.